In a design somewhat contrary to the jumbo jet moniker, the Boeing 747SP was, on the surface, an outlandish variant of the company's superbly successful 747 family of large airliners, though in reality played a vital part in the provision of early ultra-long-haul flights across the globe, primarily with major carriers such as Pan Am, Iran Air and Qantas. Sadly, the timing of the 747SP's release was very poor, as with the machine entering the marketplace only 3 years after the onset of the oil crisis, thus destroying the viability of ultra-long-haul flights, the 747SP was found to have no market to serve, and thus would become an obscurity of the wider aviation world, despite each of the small number of units built being able to attain long and fruitful careers. In 1970, a new wave of large, wide-body airliners was redrawing the lines of the aviation industry by bringing air travel to the masses, with 1969 seeing Boeing unveil the world's first wide-body jet airliner, the 747, a four-engine behemoth that was completely unprecedented when compared to the narrow bodies of the previous decade, such as the Douglas DC-8 and the preceding Boeing 707. Having taken many of the underpinnings from an earlier military transport concept, Boeing chief engineer Joe Sutter was able to marry a highly practical design with an instantly recognizable shape among both enthusiasts and the general public to create a cultural icon, and one that was able to garner incredible success among mainstream carriers, perfectly combining capacity, style, and a favorable seat-per-mile cost. To combat the 747, America's two other major aircraft builders, Lockheed and the newly formed McDonnell Douglas, developed their own wide-body jet airliners, the L-1011 TriStar and the DC-10 respectively, though unlike the 747, the DC-10 and the TriStar were fitted with 3 engines and only comprised a single passenger deck, their intention being to exploit a notable gap in Boeing's market strategy in the medium to long-range sector. To this end, the medium to long-range sector could only be supplied by 2 Boeing models, the 707 and the 747, with the 707, which was the company's original jet airliner from 1958, being a narrow-body design that, in its largest configuration, could only seat 194 passengers, which was deemed too small in the face of emerging wide-body trends. The 747, meanwhile, could carry 366 passengers, but its sheer size and fuel consumption meant it didn't have the flexibility or efficiency to either fly into certain airports or appeal to certain carriers, giving Lockheed and Douglas the perfect opportunity to undercut Boeing with their trijets, which were both more efficient and more flexible than the 747, but presented greater capacity than the 707. Initial variants of these trijets, the DC-10 Series 10 and the Lockheed L-1011-1, were built primarily for the domestic market, catering for transcontinental operations between the major cities of the United States, though long-haul versions for international services were eagerly developed in order to challenge the 747 on the lucrative transatlantic market. Boeing were acutely aware of this problem, with Joe Sutter quickly identifying that the fastest way to create an airliner that would evenly match the DC-10 and the TriStar would be to take an existing product and modify it accordingly, as developing an entirely new airframe would likely take up to nearly a decade to research and build, with Sutter therefore proposing a shortened version of the 747-100 that would be optimized through reduced weight for both transcontinental and international flights. The project was thus launched as the 747SP or short body, but this gave rise to the nickname of Sutter's balloon, thereby leading to a swift alteration of the title to SP or Special Performance, while despite the process of developing a shortened fuselage for the new model being simple enough, matters regarding competitive fuel consumption were still a serious concern in order to put the 747SP on par with the DC-10 and the TriStar. The first concept was to build the 747SP as a trijet, with 2 large turbofan engines beneath the wings and a third engine placed on the vertical stabilizer in an S-duct configuration similar to that of the TriStar, and while this presented a 33% reduction in fuel consumption, as well as shaving 7 tons of weight, the center of gravity, as on most trijets, was forced towards the rear of the airframe, and thus both the fuselage and wings would require revision in order to compensate. Therefore, Boeing withdrew the trijet concept, followed shortly thereafter by the intervention of Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, as one of the company's most loyal customers, who requested an airliner model that provided the capacity of a DC-10 but the flight range of a conventional 747, and would be dedicated to the carrier's longest routes, where demand was too low to justify the operation of a 747 at half capacity or less. As Douglas and Lockheed were already developing long-haul versions of their trijets to match this requirement, Boeing hastily returned to the concept of including 4 engines while reducing fuel consumption through weight-saving methods elsewhere in the design. In September 1973, the Boeing Board of Directors approved the 747SP project, with Pan Am ordering 10 units with an option for a further 15. The proposed delivery date of this model being 1976, and each aircraft would be valued at $280 million. The Boeing market research teams indicating that the 747SP model could potentially see up to 214 aircraft built, and the project would break even financially at 45 units. The design of the 747SP considered a reduction in size from the 747-100 by 48 feet through the removal of frames fore and aft of the wings, bringing the total fuselage length to 184 feet, resulting in an airliner that weighed 11,000 pounds less than a 747-100, while providing a passenger capacity of between 276 and 343 passengers, depending on configuration. These weight savings, combined with a 50,000-pound fuel capacity that was more than the 747-100 but less than the 747-200, meant the aircraft was capable of flying 7,650 miles, making it the longest-range airliner ever built to that time. The use of lighter materials and less complex single-slot flaps to replace the triple-slot flaps of the 747-100 and 200 helped to improve fuel efficiency further, while underwing aileron housings, known as canoes, were also omitted, other visible differences being 10 more feet of span in the horizontal stabilizer, a slightly taller vertical stabilizer, a double-hinged rudder, and a tapering of the upper fuselage into the empennage, though the redesigned center fuselage section also necessitated a redesign of the wing fillets to improve airflow. On May 19, 1975, the first production 747SP, November 530 Papa Alpha, was rolled out at the Boeing Everett factory in Washington state, and, after extensive ground testing, made its maiden flight 2 months later on July 4th, with Boeing test pilot Jack Waddell, who had also performed the maiden flight of the original 747 prototype in 1969, conducting both simulated stalls and flying the airliner at its maximum speed of 542 knots during the 3-hour flight. Testing of the revised 747SP design, with reduced weight but equal power to its fellow 747-100 and 200 variants, illustrated performance that far exceeded estimates, and thus Boeing put their new airliner to the test on a non-stop flight between New York and Tokyo on November 12, 1975, a distance of 7,015 miles, with the 4th unit built, November 40135, conducting the flight in 13 hours and 33 minutes while carrying 200 passengers, the airliner presenting a remaining fuel supply of 30,000 pounds after landing. Following its successful record-breaking flight, the airliner flew to Mexico on November 27th as part of a promotional visit, before undertaking a 29-day demonstration tour to 18 cities across the globe, racking up 72,152 miles and over 140 hours flying time on its travels. Following further successful tests of the 747SP, type certification was granted by the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, on February 4, 1976, with the record-breaking November 40135, now christened the name Clipper Freedom, and registered November 533 Papa Alpha, being delivered to Pan Am a month later on March 5th, with commercial operations beginning from April of the same year, initially on the New York to Tokyo run, before being expanded further afield. On May 1, 1976, Clipper Freedom began a circumnavigation of the world, flying from New York to New Delhi, then to Tokyo Haneda, and then back to New York with 98 passengers, the result being the airliner setting another world record for fastest circumnavigation of the Earth, having flown around the world in a mere 39 hours and 25 minutes, while covering 23,137 miles. While the 747SP proved itself to be an incredible performer, the airliner wasn't truly able to succeed in the manner Boeing's market researchers had hoped, as during development of the airliner, the fuel crisis of 1973 had resulted in many carriers getting cold feet with regard to large airliners such as the 747, and thus they were quick to abandon the jumbo jet early on and revert to more fuel-efficient trijets. The 747SP was no different, especially with regard to its primary customer Pan Am, as prior to the fuel crisis, Pan Am had adopted a policy centered entirely around the development of high-capacity long-haul routes using an extensive fleet of Boeing 747s, and thus took on dozens of the type in order to support this expansion. However, the sudden influence of the fuel crisis and the economic recession that followed meant that less people were flying and fuel prices were increased substantially, which severely damaged Pan Am's financial stability. And though this fiscal punishment would haunt the airline for the rest of its existence, in the immediate aftermath of the 1973 fuel crisis, the airline was forced to reduce its order of 25 units to just the initial 10, thereby casting uncertainty on the 747SP project as well. Thus, Boeing attempted to endear the 747SP to other carriers, both in America and worldwide, to try and meet the 45-unit break-even mark, and despite the airliner being optimized for a niche role, the aircraft did sell in small numbers to a variety of airlines, with the launch customers for this model outside of Pan Am, including Iran Air, who took on 4 units between 1976 and 1979 for non-stop services between Tehran and New York. Other operators of the type included South African Airways, which received 5 aircraft for operations between Johannesburg and New York, while Australian international carrier Qantas took on 2 units during 1981 to work short-haul, high-capacity flights between Sydney and Wellington, New Zealand, due to the unique landing conditions at the latter's airport, where the runway was too short for regular 747 operation, as well as being affected by erratic winds and poor weather. Qantas, therefore, utilized its 2 747SPs, Victor Hotel Echo Alpha Alpha, City of Gold Coast Tweed, and Victor Hotel Alpha Echo Bravo, to work this comparatively short route in order to allow for more profitable payloads despite the operational limits placed by the airport authorities for safety reasons, exploiting the model's superb short-field performance, the 2 Qantas units later being dedicated to non-stop Sydney to Los Angeles services later in the 1980s. Perhaps the most surprising user of the 747SP was the Civil Aviation Administration of China, or CAAC, which ordered 3 units in 1980 for operations to Europe and the United States, a clear sign of bridges being made between the communist superpower and the Western nations after years of political hostility. Sadly, the overarching commercial instability of the 747SP, due to the post-fuel crisis economic climate, meant that on average no more than 7 units were built per year, peaking at 14 airframes built in 1976 and 9 in 1980, a clear indication to the Boeing management that the 747SP had failed to garner the same recognition as the Douglas DC-10 and the Lockheed TriStar, which would go on to sell 386 and 250 units respectively during their production lives. Furthermore, the enactment of the Extended Range Twin Operations or ETOPS regulations by the FAA during 1978, which replaced the outdated 60-minute rule for 2-engine jet airliners, allowed for wide-body twin jets, such as the Airbus A300, to operate across large bodies of water on the transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes, meaning Boeing could now develop its own dedicated twin-jet long-haul widebody in the form of the Boeing 767, as launched in September 1982. The 767 provided capacity largely equivalent to the 747SP, but at half the fuel consumption, and with the arrival of this new model, Boeing brought a halt to the 747SP program in the summer of 1982, with the last unit, Yankee India Alpha Lima Mike, being delivered to Iraqi Airways on August 5th, bringing total production of the fleet to 44 units, 1 less than the forecast break-even. This wasn't entirely the end of production, though, as in March 1987, one final 747SP was rolled out of the Everett factory, Alpha 6 Zulu Sierra November, this aircraft having been ordered specially from the Boeing company by the government of the United Arab Emirates, but was eventually taken up by the government of Oman, who purchased the airliner as a birthday present for the nation's Sultan, Qaboos bin Said. After construction at Boeing's Everett factory, the airliner was fitted out to the Sultan's personal specification by the D. Howard Company at San Antonio International Airport under the project name S582, with the total cost of the aircraft's customization, including communications and onboard security systems, coming to over $100 million. Despite the overall commercial failure of the 747SP project, the airliner's performance still meant it was capable of achieving great feats and securing records for longest non-stop flights, with one example taking place during the delivery flight of South African Airways Boeing 747SP Zulu Sierra Sierra Papa Alpha Matroosburg, which performed the longest non-refueled flight in history at 10,290 miles, while carrying 50 passengers from the Everett plant to Johannesburg, and was even able to present enough fuel after landing for a further 2.5 hours worth of flight time. Between October 28th and October 30th, 1977, Pan Am Flight 50, operated by the record-breaking 747SP November 40135, now named Clipper Liberty Bell, was flown around the world via the North and South Poles, from San Francisco to London, Cape Town, Auckland, then back to San Francisco. This was followed between January 29th and 31st, 1988, by United Airlines 747SP, November 147 Uniform Alpha Friendship 1, flying 23,125 miles around the world, from Seattle to Athens, Taipei, and back to Seattle, in association with the Friendship Foundation, a charity supporting children and parents with special needs, beating the previous record set by Clipper Freedom in 1976 for fastest circumnavigation and raising $500,000 for the Friendship Foundation, this record standing for only a month, before Gulfstream CEO Al Paulson beat the run in one of his Gulfstream 4 private jets. Another testament to the 747SP's superb design is the fact that it never suffered a fatal incident in its commercial life, but has been involved in 3 accidents resulting in 2 hull losses. On February 19, 1985, China Airlines Flight 006, operating between Taipei and Los Angeles with 274 people aboard, suffered an in-flight failure in the number 4 engine, and while the crew attempted to rectify the problem, they failed to notice that the aircraft was rolling over and soon had fallen into a steep dive. With gravitational forces of between 4.8 and 5.1 g being exerted on the airliner and its complement, equivalent to those experienced on a roller coaster, the 747 tumbled through a sustained 31,500-foot descent before eventually being leveled out at around 9,500 feet, leading to severe damage to its leading edges and the severe injury of 2 passengers who were thrown against the interior bulkheads, the plane eventually limping 341 miles to the nearest airport at San Francisco, where it landed safely. On October 5, 1998, South African Airways 747SP Zulu Sierra Sierra Papa Foxtrot, leased to LAM Mozambique Airlines, suffered an uncontained failure in the number 3 engine shortly after departure from Maputo Airport in Mozambique, with debris damaging the number 4 engine and the leading edge of the wing, the aircraft subsequently catching fire in flight, but was able to safely return to the field with its complement of 66 passengers and crew, though the airliner was subsequently damaged beyond repair and scrapped. The final hull loss of a 747SP was that of 7 Oscar Yankee Mike November, which was the personal airliner of the President of Yemen, Abdrabdu Mansur Haidi, which, on the night of March 19, 2015, was caught in the crossfire of a vicious gun battle at Aden International Airport between rebel fighters and government forces during the early days of the Yemeni civil war, with the airliner, together with a stored Boeing 737, being struck by small arms fire, setting both aircraft ablaze and leaving only their wings and engines to identify their remains. Operations of the Boeing 747SP remained prominent during the 1980s, but the changing economies of the aviation market, as well as the introduction of highly efficient twin-jet replacements like the Boeing 767, meant the number of airliners in service began to fall towards the end of that decade, compounded further by a general move away from low-demand long-haul flights by carriers. In 1986, as the airline continued to reel from the 1973 oil crisis, and having lost much of its position in the market due to the airline deregulation of 1978, Pan Am sold its trans-Pacific operations to United Airlines, which inherited their fleet of 747SPs, the company retaining 11 units into the 1990s, while selling the remaining 13 ex-Pan Am units to other carriers. United Airlines operating 747 SPs on services across the Pacific to Japan and Hong Kong, as well as on flights to London. Trans World Airlines, which had bought 3 units in 1980, sold them to American Airlines in 1986, who also put them to work on supplementing trunk routes between the United States and London, before withdrawing them in 1994, while in China, CAAC and its successor Air China, as well as China Airlines and Mandarin Airlines of Taiwan, operated an extensive fleet of 747 SPs well into the late 1990s, with retired units seeing short-term leases to carriers such as Corsair, Alliance, Air Atlanta Icelandic, Namib Air, and UTA. However, by the turn of the millennium, it was clear that the 747 SP was long past its first bloom of youth, and with the increased presence of highly efficient twin-jet wide-body airliners, such as the Airbus A330 and Boeing 777, the continued operation of these planes made little commercial sense, with the first 747 SP to be scrapped being the record-breaking Clipper Freedom, which, after all its achievements, ended its days largely unnoticed at the Ardmore Municipal Airport, being broken up in 1997. United Airlines would prove to be the last American carrier to operate the 747 SP in routine service, with their final example, November 147 Uniform Alpha, being withdrawn from use in April 2001, while the post-9/11 market crash meant use of the 747 SP, like many classic widebodies of the 1970s, diminished quickly, until the only commercial operator of the type was Iran Air. Iran Air maintained a fleet of 4 units, employing them on services between Tehran and Kuala Lumpur, but finally ceased operating the 747 SP on June 11, 2016, with 1977-built Echo Papa India Alpha Charlie doing the honors, this airliner having worked its entire life operating with the carrier. As of May 2024, there are now 2 747 SPs known to still be in operation, both of which are with Pratt & Whitney Canada as engine testbeds, while those units recently retired included various government transports, a VIP airliner worked by the Las Vegas Sands Casino and Resort Company, and a former United Airlines unit employed by NASA as part of the SOFIA program, or Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. The SOFIA 747 SP, which made use of November 145 Uniform Alpha, was converted for use by NASA and the German Aerospace Center in 1997, wherein the airliner was fitted with an 8.2-foot diameter infrared reflecting telescope located in a contained section in the rear hull and enclosed behind a large sliding door, the telescope being used for infrared astronomy and has observed celestial magnetic fields, star-forming regions, comets, nebulae, and the galactic center, the SOFIA 747 SP being retired on September 29, 2022, after 921 flights. Outside of those units still in operation, 17 examples are known to be stored, and 1 unit has been formally preserved, that being former South African Airways Zulu Sierra Sierra Papa Charlie Maluti, which was built for the carrier in 1976 and operated with the airline until retirement in 2003. Working flights between Johannesburg and Perth in Australia, this aircraft being officially handed over to the South African Airways Museum Society and flown to their site at Rand Airport near Germiston on September 30, 2006. Another notable survivor is November 4522 Victor, the same aircraft involved in the China Airlines Flight 006 incident of 1985, which was retired from China Airlines in 1997 and later put to work with Mandarin Airlines for around a year, before eventually being bought by the Global Peace Ambassadors in 2001, a UN business action group. The aircraft worked for Global Peace Ambassadors until 2005, whereupon it was stored at Tijuana Airport in Mexico for a proposed overhaul that never took place, and since then has continued to languish under the Mexican sun, being occasionally moved about the field or placed inside the hangar. Another noted survivor is Yankee India Alpha Lima Mike, the last unit of the original production run, which has been sat at Tozeur Nefta Airport in Tunisia since January 1991, alongside Boeing 747-270C, Yankee India Alpha Golf Papa, these 2 Iraqi Airways aircraft having been flown there for safekeeping during the First Gulf War to avoid capture or destruction, but were never reinstated by Iraqi Airways after the end of the conflict, continuing to sit quietly under the Tunisian sun for over 30 years and have now been largely stripped for parts. Overall, the Boeing 747 SP was an interesting experiment in making the 747 a more flexible airliner for the 1970s, despite the fact that even before its release, the market into which the machine had been built was largely robbed from it by the effects of the 1973 oil crisis, meaning it would never result in the commercial performance anticipated by Boeing's original research team. Nevertheless, the aircraft that resulted was a superbly built and well-performing jetliner that suited the role it was built for perfectly, proving that despite its somewhat odd proportions, the 747 SP was far more than met the eye.